Hello, tylagorn here with another video. So on this channel so far, I've mostly just kind of done little showcases, tips and tricks, things like that. But I haven't really done any showcases of larger projects. So I wanted to start off with maybe one of the most important farms that I can think of, which is, of course, the cocoa bean farm. You know, they're useful for anything from chocolate chip cookies to brown dye to who knows what else. Anyway, moving on. Right now I'm in the end complex of my survival server, and I'm here for a specific reason. So if this is basically a gravity block duplication setup with some storage. So we have, for instance, just regular gravity blocks like the various concrete powders, sands, and gravel, and anvils, and so forth. And then the next wing that we have would be something for concrete itself. You know, the falling block entities are converted into regular concrete, conveyed along here into a blast chamber, then sorted. And in both of these cases, as long as you have one of the item that you're trying to generate with the duplicator, you're good. You don't need any more of anything. Just the materials for that one item, and then you can get as much as you want. Things get a bit hairier, of course, once we start thinking about stained glass variants, because we can't duplicate the glass itself. We have to duplicate regular sand, which then gets brought over here, smelted into plain glass, and then we have to use, you know, crafting recipes with various dyes. So bringing things back into the context of the video, brown dye. The only way we're going to get that is with a lot of cocoa beans. And if we want, each of these silos can store up to 1 million of the material there. So 1 million brown stained glass, that's going to require 125,000 brown dye. So that same amount of cocoa beans. So yeah, well, I guess let's head on over to creative mode. I'll just show off the outside of this real quick and see it over in creative. All right, so if we want a lot of cocoa beans, we essentially have two options, right? First, we could place a lot of beans and rely on random ticks, or second, we could use bone meal to speed things up, like what's going on in the design behind me. This is, at this point, close to a decade old, designed by Ilmango. You know, if you're not familiar with it, you just basically turn it on and place, and it's getting bone mealed very, frequently, and then broken when it's in the full growth state. So something like this, at first glance, you might think is the best option, and for most use cases, that's probably true. But I was actually able to beat the output of this by something like 40%, and then also, frankly, it just gets a little bit boring doing designs like this that rely on a large bone meal supply when there's already a lot of farms, like tree farms and so forth, that you, more or less for most of them, you can't do without bone meal. So I just wanted to do something different, and I'm actually beating the rates of this, which I'm pretty proud of. Here's the basic idea for the farm. First, we want to break and place cocoa beans as close to continuously as possible. So our best option is going to be something where the player's moved around automatically, like this. Say they place that row, and then they get moved to another row and back and forth. And, basically these get broken and, right before the player arrives and that sort of thing. But most of the designs that I've seen for this involve something like this, where the player is looking at the side of the logs, which is kind of a big limitation because you don't actually have to look at the log. You can say, like in this case, we're placing against the ceiling. We can place them a lot faster. In fact, well, if we were down a little bit lower, we'd be able to place 4 beans every single step of the flying machine or whatever's pushing the player along. So that's already a much better design. So there's no return on this one. So I can show you kind of the idea that I came up with for that. So combining basically wall stone and leaf stone is really the way to go for this. So the reason for that is that if we did all leaves, which I can actually show that real quick, if I'm see how all the pistons cascade, it doesn't actually affect which column gets returned because everything except the one that you're sending up is already down, but that's a lot of extra like block events and so forth. And then if I just did walls. Oh, there's my cat. Oscar, what's up, dude? What's up, little man? He's making his debut. If I'm just using the walls here, you can see that the middle ones, they're too small, and the hitbox, there's no I can actually get a little closer. That there's like no overlap in between the edge of the hitbox here and the edge of the hitbox. So there's no player position in which you're able to place the first bean and then also subsequently place the next three. So alternating between the walls and the leaves, that takes care of both problems. By the way, here's what the top of this looks like. We've got an observer that's looking at the wall/leaf, powers this block, which QC powers the piston, and that is updated by alternating golden and activator rails. So this is kind of a mock-up of what it would look like. The player's moving back and forth, placing beans. And by the way, the reason for this layout, the most space-efficient layout for logs and beans is going to be this. This is like 80% coverage, but I mean, think about a flying machine being able to take a player around. Even if you simplify and send the player back and forth this way, there's like 1, 2, 3, 4, like 4 distinct player alignments in the flying machine, and this is probably impossible, if not completely unfeasible. The next densest would be something like this, but that also suffers from a similar issue. So I just decided to go every other log bean like that. So we just have regular rows. All right, so at this point we can already start thinking about the flying machine. Now, based on the layout that we determined is best, we need something that takes a player around, zigzags them back and forth, and then returns them to a launching/docking station. So that would be our circuit. And every time, whenever you want to stop the farm, basically just docks the player right here. Now, if we're counting, we have all 4 cardinal directions that the flying machine would need to travel. So the only thing that's going to work, obviously, is a 4-way flying machine. And Slimestone's a bit out of my wheelhouse, so I kind of just borrowed a design from an Ilmango farm, and it works perfectly here. I kind of had to come up with custom, like redirection mechanisms and so forth. But pretty cool design. It relies on piston update order, which is part of the reason why it works perfectly in some directions, and I can actually show that here. So here, there's really nothing causing this to go around there, and then you see this redirection happens. There's one right here, and then kind of zigzags its way through here. Let's maybe take a look at a fully functional scale model of the farm as I designed it, then I can point out a couple of things here. So I'm going to pop down a player. Actually, all right, so the farm's going to start. You'll notice first that he gets jostled around. That's some player alignment stuff that I had to figure out. Happens again here. But the next thing I'm going to point out is that the columns, let's see, get pushed up just before the AFK player arrives. What that does is it accomplishes a couple of things. One, it minimizes downtime, but 2, it makes pretty much all the beans that fall down fall past the AFK player, so we don't have any resupply mechanism that we have to worry about because it's taken care of by the farm layout itself. Yeah, the player alignment, I'm going to point that out in a little bit more detail. So there's a really subtle difference in the player position needs when we're going, in this case, south versus north. So those little pistons, what they do is they basically push the AFK player, or in this case, pull them like 2.4 centimeters to the left, and then this is going to pull them 2.4 centimeters to the right. And that subtle difference is small enough that the player can still target the underside of the beans, but it's apparently good enough to fix some consistency issues that I was noticing in the farm. Hey, Tylagorn from the editing room here. In this next section, I'm kind of presenting a solution out of context of a problem, so I wanted to talk about that. Since we're using the same flying machine to go both left and right, we need to have a unique observer position to push up the columns on the leading edge of wherever the player happens to be going. So here, this would work, but if we're going in the other direction, we need to find a way to move that observer over to the other side of the flying machine, and then back and forth. Yeah, so this is all functional. What else is going on? I guess I'll point out a couple of other things. So we've got observers here. So you'll notice that this observer gets picked up by the flying machine and then jostled around to the other side for the return. Now, once it gets over here, it's going to get pulled out, and then a second observer does the same thing. Now, finally, on this side, this last observer going to get jostled around to the other side of the flying machine and brought all the way back to the front, where both are then repositioned for the next trip. So this is kind of a weird solution, but it's the only way I could figure out to dynamically alter the flying machine so that when it's on its way to the north, basically whichever way it's going, the leading edge of the flying machine is the one that has the observer that triggers the column pushing. So kind of neat. Some interesting stuff going on with like butted pistons. These triple piston extenders, I had to basically custom design these so that they start out with a butted piston. So we'll watch what happens here one more time. Here comes our observer. As soon as it's updated, it gets pulled back and then takes the next one. Same thing happens here where we've got a butted piston that pulls the observer out of the way. And then you'll watch this one, pulls that out of the way. And then just as the flying machine gets out of the way, everything resets. So, yeah, pretty neat, I would say. I'm going to go ahead and manually turn this off, and then maybe we'll go into the next section, which really, if we're keeping track, the only thing left is scaling it up. So there it is. We'll go take a look at that here in a moment. All right, so here's the full-scale design. There are a couple of things that we needed to consider over here, of course. One, we need item collection, because it would be kind of silly to do all of this without that. We need a storage system, obviously, and then we have to figure out kind of exactly how big this thing needs to be, or at least, the point of diminishing returns and making it larger. So the average time that it takes for a bean, cocoa bean, actually, they're called cocoa. It's not a cocoa pod, it's just cocoa. Anyway, average time for cocoa to grow from freshly placed age 0 to ready to harvest age 2. About 12 minutes, if memory serves. The cycle time of this farm is about 45 minutes. So why is it so much larger than the average? Well, I mean, think about what that average means. If it were only a 12-minute cycle, by the time that the player who's operating it, by the time they get to the beans that they've already placed, probably about half aren't going to be ready to harvest. So we need to make it considerably larger. Yeah, the other thing, item collection, not really much to say about this. Kind of a, by this point, standard design in an infinitely expandable water stream. Items that land right behind it, kind of get enough momentum to pass under it. Items that land on top, kind of obviously flow. And then the same thing happens over here. Sends everything into a standard, water elevator. And then I've got a little bit of a funny vertical item recirculation loop that is essentially just cascading the items over 6 shulker box loaders. Now the other thing here with the storage system, though, is that there's a little bit of extra logic that I added. So there's a couple of different situations that come up a lot in storage tech, even just basic stuff like this, where, okay, we can imagine if we fill up our entire storage, this is 1 million, basically standard on our server at this point, million item silo. If this is filled, then the boxes that get broken are just going to back up into these hoppers, and then we're going to start having perfectly good shulker boxes that get wasted due to despawn. So what we want is basically to send a signal, and as soon as the storage system is filled, then it locks the input. At the same time, what it does is it redirects the water stream. Now everything's going into cactus storage. And also important, these hoppers are locked so that nothing can pass in and we don't have any despawn issues. Kind of and gated to that is the output or the fill level of this chest. So I'll go ahead and turn this off. If we remove all of these items, this torch turns on, which accomplishes the same thing. Now, in both of these cases, it's also retracting this block, which means that even though we have our farm explicitly turned on with a lever here, the trapdoor that opens up the note block that the player clicks to restart his cycle, or her, or theirs, that note block is no longer accessible. So kind of a smart system that shuts off the farm, even if, you know, in this case, we've only gone 10% through the farm. There's another, 38 minutes cycle time. All of these items that are coming through, they're not going to cause shulker boxes to get wasted. They're just going to despawn. Rather, they're going to get cactused. So this is a farm. I guess the last thing I should say about it before moving on is that it's most practical with a bot. Okay. So the reason for that is that, one, we're on a honey block, so that's pretty good with anything that's server side processed. But the client side, if you have a tenuous connection on the server that you're playing on or something, you would not be able to AFK this. But let's imagine that you had a perfect connection. You can still AFK this, but the problem is we need to place items a little bit faster than you can in vanilla. So it worked just fine. It's just not going to be full capacity here. So you may be thinking, oh, okay, well, there's carpet commands for that. And yes, there are. This is player, tylagorn, use interval 2 would be fast enough. See, there we go. But say we don't want to do that. Say, no, I want to be vanilla, okay? So we can actually go into keybinds, and we're going to change place, or use/place, to just a random thing that doesn't get used. This is like the period on my, the decimal point on my numeric keypad. So now, watch what happens when I press that. So there it is. Not a lot of people know this, but you can place items really fast, faster than the vanilla right click in vanilla with just a keybind. So there we go, and then there'd be the control reload texture packs or whatever it is that makes it so you don't have to hold this, or you can just place a weight on your key and go to bed and get up. So yeah, pretty neat, right? I think so. All right, I think that pretty much covers everything. We're going to go ahead and do a block-by-block tutorial at this point. Well, actually, that's probably a horrible idea. But instead of that, I guess we'll do a time-lapse of us building this in survival on our server. So enjoy. All right. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. If you got to this point, I don't normally ask this and it's kind of feels weird, but, consider liking, subscribing, all that kind of stuff. I feel like if you watched a 9-minute time lapse and, got to the end of a 30-minute video about a bean farm, you might be into some more stuff that I'm going to be doing here soon. So, yeah, anyways, as you can see behind me, we've got a full storage here. I am in survival, and we have 1 million cocoa beans ready to go. The plan here, once we upgrade to have like 1.21 plus, we're going to have some automatic crafter silos so we can have, somewhere between 5 and 10 million brown dye stored up here. So, yeah. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time.